The Doom of the Haunted Opera by Brad Strickland and John Bellairs, Chapter 7. The disturbing fog hung in a circle all around New Zebedee. As Lewis and Rosarita tested the boundaries, they found they could not get beyond the city limits on the Homer Road or on routes 9 or 12. They got a little farther, going cross-country through Wilder Creek Park. In fact, they left the park behind and started up Cemetery Hill, where they had to get off and walk their bikes. Oak Ridge Cemetery was south of town, on a high, flat ridge that was cut across by 2 dirt roads. Rosarita and Lewis paused to park their bikes under the gate of the cemetery. This was a heavy stone arch covered with elaborate carving. On the lintel over their heads were inscribed these words: "The trumpet shall sound and the dead shall be raised." Lewis felt his knees trembling. He had avoided the cemetery for years. Years ago, he and a boy named Tarby Corrigan had come here on Halloween at midnight. Lewis had been trying to show off, and he cast a necromancy spell, a spell meant to raise the dead, outside the Izzard tomb. He still had nightmares about what had come out of that sinister mausoleum. "Look at that," said Rosarita in a voice filled with awe. They gazed down, over the bare black trees in the park, and back at the town of New Zebedee. To their left and right, long arms of gray fog swept in on either side of the town, right along the city limits. They could not see beyond the town, but Lewis was willing to bet that the fog was there too. They could see nothing but fog everywhere, heavy, sluggish, and gray, like the underside of a storm cloud. That wasn't right. The sun had been shining, so the fog should have been brighter and lighter. Rosarita sighed and climbed onto her bike. "Let's see if we can get out through the cemetery." With his heart thumping hard, Lewis plodded after her down the dirt road. They passed a section of the cemetery where all the monuments were carved to look like logs, and they went through the area with the statues of weeping women leaning on urns and cupids extinguishing torches. Ahead was the back fence of the cemetery, black wrought iron curlicues with decorative spearheads every 10 feet or so, and beyond that, the mysterious gray fog bank, leaking wisps here and there. They retreated to the highest part of the cemetery, where Rosarita climbed up the barred iron door of a mausoleum to stand on the roof. "It's no use," she called down. "We're surrounded." She scrambled down and drew a diagram of the dirt with a stick to explain what she had seen. The fog was everywhere except in the cemetery and in New Zebedee itself. The clear places formed a lopsided figure 8, with the smaller loop of the 8 as the cemetery and the larger one in the town. Lewis looked around fearfully. A gray stone statue down the hill, a woman in a cloak with a hood over her forehead, seemed to stare back at him. "What are we going to do?" Rosarita shook her head. "Don't ask me. We could climb the fence, but I have a feeling we wouldn't get anywhere through that fog. We'd probably just take a couple of steps away and then bang into the fence again." Lewis groaned and turned away. He felt a chill creeping up his spine. The hooded statue was closer, wasn't it? He tried to remember where it had been before. Now it seemed to be striding forward, a grim look on its pitted stone face. Lewis stared at it, but it was not moving. He swallowed hard and turned back to Rosarita. "It's the music, isn't it? When that Mr. Vanderhelm sang the song, he did something awful." "It was called the sealing," said Rosarita in a thoughtful voice. "Maybe it did some kind of magic, like sealing the town off from the outside world, and vice versa, as your uncle would say." Lewis blinked. "And the song that Miss White played first was called The Summoning. That might have been what drew Henry Vanderhelm here in the first place." "I wonder who he really is," mused Rosarita. Lewis thought he knew. "It's him. It's old Emmanuel Vanderhelm himself, come back to finish whatever it was he started back in 1919. He got the shakes and looked over his shoulder, his mouth dropped open. Rosarita considered this and shook her head. "I don't see how that's possible. Henry Vanderhelm can't be more than about 30 years old. I think he must be who he says he is, old Emmanuel's grandson." "Rosarita," stammered Lewis, "look down the hill." She frowned at him and followed his trembling, pointing finger. "It's a monument, so what? It's reaching out its arms toward us." "It's beseeching the mercy of heaven or something," said Rosarita firmly. "I know it wasn't stretching its arms out before," insisted Lewis, "and it's closer now than it was." "Maybe we better go," Rosarita said. They started downhill. They passed the stone woman, and she was soon hidden from view behind the mausoleums and other markers. Then Rosarita squealed. Then Rosarita squeaked in surprise and suddenly stopped. There she was again, ahead of them, now leaning on a tombstone, her shoulders hunched. The stone mouth had opened, and inside were 2 rows of sharp stone teeth. A forked tongue lolled out, and the hands clenching the tombstone ended in wicked hooked claws. She was just beside the path. I think we'd better go the long way, Rosarita said, her voice shaking. No one would put up a memorial like that. They nearly ran for the main road, leaving the grotesque statue behind. The dirt road led steeply to the stone arch where they had left their bikes. "Oh no," said Lewis. "Look up there." A huddled shape crouched on the arch, like a lion hunched waiting for the kill. They could see it only in silhouette, and it no longer looked very human, but Lewis knew in his heart that it was the moving statue waiting for them. "We can't stay here forever," whispered Rosarita. "Look, we never see it move, right?" "But it does move. Let's try something. Come on." Rosarita plunged into the stone forest of carved logs, with Lewis trotting desperately behind her. They came to a small clearing and stood back to back, peering around. "I see her," Rosarita said grimly. Lewis turned, feeling cold and weak. He saw the woman too, only she was no longer a woman, but a thing perched on top of the tombstone, carved like an upright log. Her toothy face had grown sharp-snouted and snake-like, her knotted arms impossibly long. The hood had become a cobra's hood, and she had no legs at all, just a long, coiling serpent's tail wrapped around and around the log she perched on. Her eyes looked alive, now glaring at them with hatred and hunger. I want you to back up to the main road," Rosarita said, her voice shaky. "Don't take your eyes off me till you get there, and when I tell you, look straight at the gate. Tell me if she's gone." But there she is on the tombstone," chattered Lewis. "There may be more than one." Lewis backed away, step after terrified step. He could not fight the feeling that a hideous stone hand would close on his shoulder at any moment. But somehow he made it to the dirt road. "I'm here," he called, his voice shrill with dread. "Look at the grave." Lewis had to wrench his gaze downhill. His heart leaped. "She's not there." "Keep your eyes on the gate," Rosarita yelled. "I'm coming toward you." Lewis heard her blundering, and in a moment she bumped into him. "I can still see her," said Rosarita in a dismal voice. "But when we move downhill, I'll lose sight of her. You keep your eyes on the gate. I'll look back this way. If she can't let us see her move, we should be all right." They inched downhill so slowly that Lewis thought they were hardly moving at all. He did not dare to blink. His feet scuffed the damp dirt. His eyes ached and watered. Closer and closer they came until they were actually under the arch. "Get on your bike," Rosarita yelled. She leaped for hers too. Lewis clambered on and found the pedals. They started away from the cemetery. From behind them grew a horrible, vicious snarl, like the frustrated cry of a hungry wolf whose prey had been just a little too fast. They flew down the road. They flew down through the park and over the brook, and at last Rosarita stopped and turned. "I think we're safe now. I don't think it can come out of the graveyard." Lewis looked up the hill. He could not be sure, but he thought he saw a crouching shadow just inside the archway. "Why is it there?" he asked, his teeth clicking as if he were freezing. "It's to keep us from getting in, I guess," said Rosarita. "Or maybe," she swallowed hard, "maybe to keep the dead from getting out." "What are we going to do?" asked Lewis in agony. "We need help," replied Rosarita. "But who? I could tell my parents, but you know how they are." Lewis nodded. George Pottinger was a nice man at heart, but tended to be grumpy and skeptical. And Louise Pottinger was a kindly, absent-minded woman who did not believe half the things Rosarita told her anyway. "How about your grandpa?" asked Lewis. "He might believe us." Rosarita shook her head. "He went to stay at my uncle's farm for the weekend. With this incredible fog, he couldn't have gotten back." She bit her lip. "I think old Vanderhelm has cast some kind of goofy spell over the grown-ups in town, too. Half of them won't believe us, and the other half are probably under Vanderhelm's power." Lewis had been thinking. "I know some grown-ups who will listen. The Capernaum County Magician Society." "That's right," said Rosarita. "Why didn't I think of that? Do you know who they are?" Lewis smiled. "My uncle is the treasurer, and he has the club ledger in his desk. It has a list of everyone who's paid dues and who hasn't, and all the names and addresses are right there in the front." "Well, let's go." Their bikes fairly flew on the way back to 100 High Street. They pulled up in front of the old stone mansion and went pounding up the steps. The front door was locked, which meant Mrs. Holtz was probably out shopping, but Louis had his own key. He and Rosarita hurried to the study, and Louis rummaged in the desk drawer until he pulled out a tall, skinny book bound in green cloth, its corners reinforced with triangles of brown leather. He plopped it down on the desk and opened it, running his finger down a list of names. "Here," he said. "Mrs. Zenobia Weatherly. She's the president of the society, and she lives over on West River Avenue." "Call her," said Rosarita. "Her number's 707. Louis tried, but the operator told him that the number had been disconnected. He hung up with a sinking heart. He and Rosarita wrote down Mrs. Weatherly's address and the names and addresses of the society vice president and secretary. Then they went outside, climbed on their bikes, and rode over to West River Avenue. They pulled up short at the place where Mrs. Weatherly was supposed to live. The house at 796 was a green clapboard cottage. The one at 800 was a neat white bungalow with a frisky fox terrier romping in front as two boys tossed a ball for him to fetch. Between them, where number 798 should have been, was a weed-choked vacant lot. From the knee-high yellow grass and dried stalks of lady's slipper, burdock, and other wild plants that grew, it would appear that no house had ever been there. Rosarita and Louis paused outside the picket fence, where the kids were playing with the dog. They must have been twins, about 8 years old, with identical blonde crew cuts and tough faces. "Hey," called Rosarita pleasantly, "can you tell us about Mrs. Weatherly?" "Huh?" one of the boys asked. He came over and clung to the picket fence, looking over the points at Rosarita and Louis. "Mrs. Who is this?" he said. "Mrs. Zenobia Weatherby," explained Rosarita. "She's supposed to live next door at 798. Did she move or something?" "You're crazy," the kid said. "Nobody lives next door. Nobody's ever lived next door. Just that old stinky lot there." He swung off the fence and grabbed the ball. "Come on, Tommy," he said. "We'll go and play in the backyard away from these crazy people." He ran around the side of the house. The other boy, who did not appear as tough as his brother, lingered a moment. He looked at Louis and Rosarita with round, frightened eyes. "I thought somebody lived there," he whispered. "An old lady with gray hair, and her house was a big brick place with a tower. But everybody says I just dreamed that." Then he ran after his brother. Louis and Rosarita stared at each other. In a grave voice, Rosarita asked, "Who's next on the list?" They checked the addresses where the vice president and the secretary were supposed to live, but the outcome was the same. Instead of houses, they found weedy, vacant lots, and the neighbors insisted that no houses had ever been there, although one old man looked troubled and uncertain even as he was shooing Louis and Rosarita away. The two rode their bikes over to St. George's Church, where Louis attended Mass. They rested in the side yard of the church, sitting on a cool stone bench beneath a maple tree. "He's outfoxed us," admitted Rosarita. "Old Vanderhelm didn't miss a trick. Somehow or other, he's done away with all the members of the Capernaum County Magician Society who might have helped us." "Done away with them?" squeaked Louis. "You don't mean—" Rosarita pushed her glasses into place on her nose and shrugged. "I don't think he's killed them, if that's what you're worried about, but he's sealed them off somehow, just like he sealed off the town. They're probably in their houses right now, wondering why it's foggy all around their yards and why they can't get to the store to buy a pound of butter." "I hope so," said Louis. He could hardly bear to think of what might have happened to them. What if the spell had turned them into frogs or mice? What if they and their houses had been sent off to some bizarre planet where the population was all made up of mudmen and birdmen and tree men, like in the Flash Gordon movie serials the Bijou sometimes showed on Saturday mornings? What if they found themselves in a world of horrible, living, changing stone statues? Or, Louis tried to swallow the painful lump in his throat, or what if the spell had somehow just erased them, removed them from the world as if they had never existed? "Well," said Rosarita, breaking his gloomy train of thought, "I guess there's only one thing to do. I'll have to tell my mother about this. Would you like to come with me?" "Sure," Louis said. "You know I will." Rosarita sighed. "Thanks. Mom is all right, but she thinks everything I tell her is a lie." After a moment, she added in a small voice, "I guess I tell her too many stories." Louis realized that Rosarita was on the verge of tears, and that shook him up more than anything else. Rosarita was a very brave person. Unlike her, when Louis thought danger was around, He dithered and worried and expected terrible things to happen before anything really began. He cleared his throat and said, "Hey, that's all right, Rosarita. I like your stories." "I'll remember that when I'm a famous writer," she mumbled. "Well, let's go. No use putting it off anymore." They rode over to Madison Street. "Mom!" Rosarita yelled as they went inside. "Hey, Mom!" There was no answer. The house had that deserted feeling that houses get when no one is around. They went into the kitchen. There on the counter, beside the refrigerator, was a cookie jar in the shape of a fat, laughing clown. And under the cookie jar was a sheet of blue-lined notebook paper. Rosarita pulled it out and read it. "Oh, no," she groaned. "Now what are we going to do?" Louis took a note from her and read it. "Dear Rosie, I may not be back until late, so please have your father's dinner heated up for him. The leftover meatloaf is in the refrigerator, and you can open a can of something. That wonderful Mr. Vanderhelm called me today. Someone told him that I sing in the church choir, and he says he has just the role for me in his grandfather's opera. I agreed to come and try out, and I may be gone for a while. Imagine me right up there on stage. Of course, he may not like my voice after he hears me, but it's thrilling just to be asked. Wish me luck, dear." The note was signed, "Love, Mother." Louis let the paper fall from his numb fingers. "He knows about us," he told Rosarita, fighting down the urge to scream. "That's why he called your mom, because we've been out looking for help. He's making sure we can't do anything to stop him." For a moment, the two looked helplessly at each other. Then they both burst into frightened tears. And that is the end of chapter 7.